So welcome to this evening's presentation. My name is Michael Keller. I'm the university librarian, and I am pleased to welcome my friend Ato Quayson, who this evening will talk about suffering and tragedy from the Greeks to Toni Morrison. I'll introduce Professor Quayson, but leave it to him to do the heavy lifting implied by his title. Professor Van Jordan, right here, will respond to Professor Quayson's presentation, and after that we'll have some questions and discussion. Both of these professors came here for the evening that we celebrated the arrival of the Dykstra collection of black music recordings, and were marvelous contributors to that celebration. And I want to thank them both for having appeared then and for appearing now. So, a bit about Ato Quayson. He is the Jean G. and Morris M. Doyle Professor in Interdisciplinary Studies, Chair of the Department of English, and the inaugural Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, which officially starts its program offering courses in the fall quarter of the next academic year. I want you to know I worked at Cornell from 73 on, and they put their department together in 1968. So we're coming to the party late, but we're coming strong, that's, I think, is the way to say it. Professor Quayson studied for his undergraduate degree at the University of Ghana and took his PhD from the University of Cambridge, after which he held a junior research fellowship at Wolfson College, Oxford, before returning to Cambridge to become a reader in Commonwealth and post-colonial literature in the Faculty of English from 1995 to 2005. He was also director of the Center for African Studies and a fellow of Pembroke College while at Cambridge. Prior to Stanford, he was a professor of African and post-colonial literature at NYU from 2017 to 2019, and professor of English and inaugural director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. That brings us up to 2017. In 2016, he was appointed university professor at the University of Toronto, the highest distinction that university can bestow. He is a 2022 to 23 faculty affiliate in Stanford Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Come on in, friend, take a seat. And is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as of this year. He was elected to the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2006, the Royal Society of Canada in 2013, and the British Academy in 2019. Now, Van Jordan. Van Jordan is the author of 4 collections: Rise, which won the Penn/Oakland Josephine Miles Award, published by Tia Chucha Press in 2001. Macnolia, 2005, which was listed as one of the best books of 2005 by the London Times. Quantum Lyrics in 2007, and the Cineasta, is that how we say it? Cineast. It shows you my lack of reading and education and whatnot, in 2013 by W.W. Norton, one of my favorite publishers. Jordan has been awarded a Whiting Writers Award, an Anisfeld Wolf Book Award, and a Pushcart Prize. He is also a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2007 and a United States Artist Fellowship in 2009. He also won the Lannan Literary Award in Poetry in 2015. His forthcoming book, When I Waked, I Cried to Dream Again, will be released in June of 2023. This is another W.W. Norton book. And we're going to celebrate that publication next fall in this place, so stay tuned. You're all welcome. He served as the Robert Hayden Collegiate Professor of English Literature at the University of Michigan, and he is currently a professor in the Department of English at this very institution, Stanford. Ato, over to you, my friend.
So, thank you all very much for coming. It's wonderful not to have to talk to myself, which I do all the time. At least now I have an audience. So I am I'm going to try and keep it to roughly 35 to 40 minutes so that Van can respond and we'll have ample time for questions. So I'm putting my timer on. Let's see what happens here. I don't worry. No, I worry about you. Why should I not worry about you, man? You're my brother. I have to worry about you. Now, in common parlance, the word tragedy means simply sad or terrible, as in the many random school shootings that we are seeing in America are a tragedy, or the Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a tragedy. And yet, the concept of tragedy itself has an old and august history, dating from the 5th century Athenian stage through many expressions, predominantly in theater, especially in the Renaissance, and then on to its migration by the 19th century into the philosophy of history, the novel, opera, film, and other venues and media. I'm going to be drawing on only a small segment of this long and indeed arduous history to make some statements about the relevance of the concept of tragedy and suffering, not just to the way we read non-Euro-American literature, but also to how we understand the concept of suffering in our world today. And I will come to rest on Toni Morrison, and hopefully you will be persuaded by the end why Toni Morrison is one of the greatest writers that this country has ever produced. Let me start off by referring to this is the cover of the book out of which I'm drawing the lecture today. Let me start off by listing the key concepts and terms that I'll be going through. So there's suffering, disputes with vehemence or disputatiousness, and each of these will be expanded upon. Hegel on tragedy, we'll touch on Hegel. Shakespeare and unruly affective economies, chiefly the Hamlet, Macbeth, and others. Historical transitions. Aristotle will be in there. We'll talk about the Nicomachean ethics. Frantz Fanon, and of course, Toni Morrison. Let me start off by drawing attention to two novels by African writers that have garnered much acclaim recently and that allow us to set out the main terms of both tragedy and suffering. So this is a preliminary. The first is At Night, All Blood is Black by the French-Senegalese writer David Diop. And the second is Open Water by the British Ghanaian Caleb Azuma Nelson. At Night, All Blood is Black is set in the trenches of the First World War somewhere in Europe and is narrated in the first person by Alpha Ndiaye, a Senegalese soldier fighting in the French army. During one unfortunate battle, Ndiaye has to hold the left hand of his more than brother and best friend, Mademba Diop, while Mademba's guts spill out onto the battlefield in the dark of night. Mademba begs his friend 3 times to kill him and to relieve him of the excruciating pain he's going through. But Ndiaye refuses and instead watches his friend die a slow and painful death. On the death of Mademba, Ndiaye feels that he can think any thought and proceeds to style himself a veritable killmonger, killing enemy soldiers at every opportunity by disemboweling them and cutting off their gun-carrying hand as trophies that he then preserves. It is a gruesome novel, but more than that, extraordinarily painful in how it shows Ndiaye's progressive descent into savagery and madness. Open Water is set in London in more recent times. The dating of the novel is provided through the many references to contemporary black music and art, which are discussed in great nuance and detail throughout the novel. It centers on the delicate and exquisitely told love story between an unnamed narrator and a girl he falls in love with at a party in London. Their relationship develops slowly against various background details of London, of its youth culture, of their immigrant parents' lives and experiences, and of their own tremulous sense of uncertainty about their black identities as British and other. The romance looks to be blossoming well until the unnamed narrator witnesses the shooting of another black man in South London, whom he was very mildly acquainted with. To make matters worse, when the police arrive, they arrest him at the scene, only letting him go after they have roughed him up. This unhappy encounter leads to the narrator's internal emotional collapse. He refuses to tell his girlfriend what has happened to him. She herself had just before the unhappy incident left for university in Dublin, also augmenting the irrational sense of abandonment felt by the narrator. Their relationship breaks down irreparably in consequence. Now, these two novels can be taken as representing two quite different but important representations of tragedy and of suffering, set, of course, in different parts of Europe, one in battlefields of France and the other one in London. And they join the many wonderful and extraordinary examples of tragedies written by minority writers in global world literature, only some of which I'll be able to refer to. Even though both novels are told in the first person, they cover love and war through distinctive narrative styles. But I also open today with At Night All Blood is Black and Open Water to highlight one of the most important key words in my understanding of tragedy, namely the concept of suffering. The first challenge to be confronted in making any statement on tragedy is, of course, definitional. And for my part, I focus on suffering as opposed to catastrophe, despite the fact that many of the texts I deal with in my book, Tragedy and Postcolonial Literature, deal with some form of death and dying. But my interest is in what the Greeks would call pathos or pathos, which is suffering. But what, then, is suffering? Suffering is either the anticipation or experience of something or things that threaten the integrity of the self. So suffering is things that are threats to biographical continuity. And we will see how this idea of disintegration will become important to my understanding of both suffering and of tragedy. Now, there are several sources, but two main sources for my thoughts on suffering. One is Eric J. Cassell's The Nature of Suffering, The Goals of Medicine. Eric Cassell is a physician in New York, and he worries about the question of pain and that the medical profession is not able to deal with pain as a concept. So as soon as they're confronted with the problem of pain, they symptomatize it and try to cure it via medicine rather than drugs, meds, rather than seeing pain as part of the holistic totality of the being, including their spiritual dispositions and so on. But he is the one who instigates the first time the idea of suffering as a form of disintegration or discombobulation. But much before Eric Cassell, there was also Cicero, whose disputations on grief have been very important for me. Now, Cicero himself was really a Stoic. And one of the fascinating things that I discovered, when I found him, was that in BC 44, he himself suffers a major catastrophe, which is that his daughter Tullia dies in childbirth. Now Cicero, goes to hide. Basically, he retires from public service to a villa and begins to write woeful letters to his best friend Pomponius Atticus. Now the letters have been gathered, and from the letters we see him in a way that we will say he's deeply depressed. He's crying all the time. He says he reads through a veil of tears. He loses his appetite. He even feels suicidal. The almighty Cicero feels suicidal, and so on. But he says something, but when he comes to, so in the letters, he's literally falling apart. But after 3 or so months, when he comes to write the disputation on grief, it is as if he's a different person. He writes the disputation in a stoical register, which is to say that what we consider misfortunes are the product of the misassessment of reality. So it is our misassessment of reality that leads us to think that something is producing suffering or not. But very different from the person who was falling apart. At any rate, he says something in the disputation on grief that fascinates me. Thus, two genera, while delight and desire, are caused by beliefs about what is good. The other two, fear and distress, are caused by beliefs about what is sad. Fear is a belief that some serious evil is impending. Distress, a belief that a serious evil is present. Specifically, it is a fresh belief, and the evil is of such a nature that it seems right to be pained by it. It seems so, at least to the person who is suffering and who believes that it's appropriate for him to note the emphasis and the hammering on belief, false belief, real belief. More importantly, for our purposes, desire scalds us, while delight makes us giddy. Fear degrades us, but the effects of distress are worse. Gauntness, pain, depression, disfigurement. It eats away at the mind and, in a word, destroys it. This we must shed. This we must cast away, or else remain in misery. Fear is a form of disfigurement. Suffering, distress, eats away at us, and so on. So these are good, I think, very useful accounts of what the impact of suffering on self-integrity. At any rate, if we go back to the novels by Diop and Ndiaye, we see how they allow us a key or clues into what is suffering. So the characters in the two novels suffer in completely different ways. In At Night, All Blood is Black, Ndiaye's psychological unraveling takes place in relation to intense hyperactivity following the death of his friend Mademba. But in reality, he's trapped in what we shall see later with respect to Toni Morrison's Beloved might be described as melancholic rememory. He's trapped in a cycle of repetition. For following Freud's account of the difference between mourning and melancholia, we might say that Ndiaye is not only unable to surrender the lost object, which is Freud. Melancholia is the inability of surrendering the lost object. He's unable to surrender the lost object, namely his more than brother Mademba, but that he's also constrained to return obsessively to the moment of his friend's death to reenact a gesture of mercy upon the lives of the enemy. It is for this gesture, repeated gesture of mercy, that he disembowels every captive and then waits for them to beg him to kill them. So he disembowels the enemy and then waits for them. Because when his friend begged him to kill, he didn't do it. So he disembowels the enemy and then waits. And when they plead with him to end their pain, then he kills them. So that he returns obsessively to the moment of, because he doesn't like the self that failed to show his friend mercy. So because he's repeatedly returning to the scene of disavowal so that he can renew himself by this act of mercy. Open water is quite different because in contrast to the hyperactivity, the character in open water suffers a form of emotional catatonia or collapse. When he sees the other black man killed, he inadvertently becomes representational. That is to say, he feels himself in the lives of every black man. So the black man's death becomes a kind of infernal mimesis of his own life. And because of this infernal mimesis, he loses love, he loses company, he loses passion, he becomes completely catatonic. Now, as we noted earlier, the history of tragedy is conventionally traced from its efflorescence on the Greek stage in 5th century Athens through its various permutations in the Renaissance theater of Shakespeare and others, and so on. Much of the relationship between the concept of tragedy and postcolonial writing has been tracked predominantly through theories of adaptation, where there's a healthy critical literature on the real workings of the Greeks and Shakespeare in various postcolonial, many beautiful adaptations. While I acknowledge this vast and rich literature, what I derive from the long history of literary tragedy, among other things, is the principle of what I call disputatiousness. Now, the OED has several definitions of the word dispute, out of which we can glean what I want to call disputatiousness. And this is from the Oxford English Dictionary: an argumentative contention or debate, a controversy, also in a weakened sense, a difference of opinion. You know, when diplomats say they had a frank exchange of views, it means they almost came to blows. So anytime they say, oh, Putin and Biden had a frank exchange of views, it means you know that there was big trouble in that room. Frequently, with the added notion of vehemence, a heated contention, a quarrel. So as I was, rereading, and I've been, immersed in the tragic tradition for a long time. One of the things that kept coming up again is the prototypical, and this is what I'm describing, dispute with vehemence, dispute with anger. The Greeks give us immense and wonderful examples. Oedipus versus Tiresias, Clytemnestra versus Agamemnon, Medea versus Jason. There's a moment when Jason comes to talk to Medea, the estranged Medea, and she rounds on him and delivers one of the most acidic insults. It's beautiful. But the determining mark of the Greek tragic characters was what might be described as their zero-sum wrath or anger. Their sense of righteousness goes as far as courting possible self-destruction. They both disagree and are also disagreeable in disagreement. Thus, Antigone, in preparing to countenance her own death and damnation in defying Creon, her uncle, by burying her brother Polynices, is prepared to die in defiance of her uncle. The contrast between Antigone and her sister is many in Sophocles' account is telling, because it's many cautions pragmatism toward Creon, while Antigone is a spokesperson for a self-assured and uncompromising tragic choice. Now, the term disputatiousness, as I am listening, I'm talking about here, places us firmly in the vicinity of Hegel's account of tragedy, which can be gleaned from his various writings, but especially from the Phenomenology of Spirit and the lecture on aesthetics. For Hegel, the Greeks illustrate the place of an ethical framework that undergirds social life. This ethical framework is guaranteed by certain institutions in Greek life, such as the oikos, the family, and the polis, the state. Hegel does not mention the army, but this is also a crucial part of what constitutes the ethical framework for the ancient Greeks, at least as represented in their tragedies. Fundamentally, for Hegel, tragedy is not the clash of right against wrong, but rather of right against right. Tragedy that comes from an agent's rightful action, set infringing upon the rightful action of another agent. The conflict that derives from this clash threatens to dissolve, this is all Hegel, threatens to dissolve the basis of the entire ethical order guaranteed by oikos and polis. Now, while Hegel refers to several tragedies in his various reflections on the concept, Sophocles' Antigone provides him with a litmus test of tragedy. One central supposition of Hegel's account is the idea of a normative ethical order behind Greek tragedy, a normative ethical order being guaranteed by the oikos and the polis. And so these legitimate institutions are what guarantee the ethical order. But this idea of a normative ethical order can be questioned even with specific reference to the Greek plays themselves, as well as recourse to studies of life in ancient Greece. It is noteworthy, for example, that the chorus of Aeschylus' The Libation Bearers, or the Koiphori, is a group of slave women who complain bitterly about the oppressive regime they have experienced under the house of Atreus, headed now by the fearsome Clytemnestra and her boyfriend Aegisthus after the assassination of Agamemnon in the first installment of the Oresteia. The significance of a chorus of slave women in the Koiphori derives from the fact that, as a rule, in Greek tragedy, the chorus tended to rehearse the terms of generally held communal beliefs and values against which was set the ethically consequential decisions of the central protagonist. Thus, for Aeschylus to present us with a chorus of slave women complaining about the condition of slavery immediately puts the normative ethical standards of the world, of the play, in serious doubt. At any rate, viewed from a more post-colonial perspective, the problems that emerge out of Hegel's account are that institutions may actually fail to act as guarantors of a shared ethical framework when they are either not organic to the society in which they are located, but are imposed from the outside, or when they prop up false or anachronistic values, such as, for example, when we discover on looking at the very long and tumultuous history of the institution of the family. The institution of the family has historically been full of unethical positions, including the undermining of women's rights to owning property and indeed determining the fate of their own bodies. In other words, contra Hegel, these are not guarantors, or there are other conditions that have to be met before we can take oikos and polis as guarantors of ethical frameworks. Now, while my understanding of disputes with vehemence or disputatiousness draws quite something from Hegel's dialectical account of tragedy, I am inclined actually to lean more toward the French philologist Jean-Pierre Vernant in his reading of Greek tragedy as illustrating, let me see if I have it here, as illustrating the incomplete, and this is the part that I really fancy, of illustrating the incomplete transition between religious and ethical domains. This is Jean-Pierre Vernant on Greek tragedy. It's an incomplete transition between religious and ethical domains, such that concepts such as decay, justice, nomos, law and custom, and ethos, the fundamental character of a spirit or a culture, all come to do double service, both in the religious and ethical domains, so that when characters invoke the word justice, they're actually using the same word decay, but they might be speaking different language because the transition is incomplete. Now, this notion of incomplete historical transition is really important to the account that I'm going to give. I'm settling on Toni Morrison, but actually the idea of colonialism and as it were, the promulgation of incomplete transitions produces suffering and tragedy in various parts of the world. Now, disputatiousness takes on a different guise in Shakespeare, where the raw and vehemently quarrelsome plays, the plays that have what I call raw disputatiousness, such as Coriolanus and Titus Andronicus, they're angry, they're disputing, they're ready to fight, are not considered among his most profound. Rather, in the major tragedies of Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, Macbeth, and I would add Antony and Cleopatra, what I'm calling historical disputatiousness, which is the product of historical transition, are correlated, and this you do not find in the Greeks, are correlated to unruly emotions or unruly affective economies. Now, what I'm describing as unruly affective economy is an amalgam of complex and often contradictory emotions that are also objectively correlated to specific images and sometimes even objects. Thus, we find that in Hamlet, Yorick's skull and Ophelia's flowers are indicative of deeply complex things that are happening to them internally, as are also the specter of the knife that dangles before Macbeth as he proceeds to the assassination of Duncan, or Othello's infamous handkerchief. All these, I think, are semblative of what I'm calling, unruly affect. But remember that for Shakespeare, what are the unsettled domains of historical transition are correlated to internal states of turmoil. Now, a play that is not a tragedy, but that I think illustrates this question of correlation really well is The Merchant of Venice. Because The Merchant of Venice is a fascinating play which stages, as it were, the overlap between what I would call economic economy and cultural economy. Economic economy is what is manifested in Shylock and the necessity of his mode of business finance for the mercantile economy illustrated in the play. So that's the economic economy. The Venetians need Shylock. But cultural economy is the Christian's notion of party, of have a good time, of separating money making from pleasure. And it is this overlap between the two economies that produces the pain of Shylock. At the end of the play, when in the court scene, the Duke turns to him and says, why do you want this pound of flesh? She's offered you 10 times the ducats. Why? And Shylock delivers an answer which on the surface makes no sense. He starts talking about animal phobias. Have you not heard? I'm misquoting here. A person who pees himself on hearing a pig mew. Just like that, he gives a long list of animal phobias that have nothing to do with why you. But actually, it's very telling because the animal phobias that he's listing, about 16 or 17 of them, actually point to the fact of his emotional turmoil at being spat at. His gabardine is spat at and being always insulted, when in fact, he's doing such great service to the community. So, I'm writing this up for another project, and I will pay serious attention to Shylock and Merchant of Venice as a site of disputatiousness. Now, still on suffering, Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, typically, anyone writing on tragedy is obliged to attend to the poetics and the standard, the poetics, catharsis, all the key terms, and I use them too. But actually, when you read the poetics alongside the Nicomachean ethics, you see something else blossoming. Because Aristotle is an ethical philosopher. And all ethical philosophers are interested in one key question: what is the good life? So it's not about what is good and what is bad, but what is the good life? And Aristotle defines the good life in a fascinating. He says, for someone to have eudaimonia, which is translated into English from the Greek variously as indwelling virtue, happiness, and also as flourishing, to have eudaimonia, you need certain conditions. One of them is what he calls worldly goods. Now, worldly goods is not just having a Porsche or a nice apartment in New York. That doesn't count as worldly goods. Worldly goods primarily involve the guarantees of philia. And this is the most important, philia. And philia is the guarantee of reciprocal relations of care from both family and friends. So Philadelphia, full of sinful people, but it doesn't matter. Philia. So philia, because for Aristotle, if you woke up one fine day and all your family and friends had perished in a tornado, for Aristotle, you would not only feel sad, obviously, but it would impair your capacity to undertake ethically salient choices. In other words, you cannot be good if you lose everything. So Aristotle thinks that to be good, you have to be propped up by what he calls worldly goods, the most important of which is philia. Now, this philia question is really crucial to an understanding of suffering, because on the loss of, if we were to translate Aristotle for modern uses, we would add that we need some of our worldly goods would include a good educational system, cheap, not as expensive as some places that we're aware of, a good educational system, good health care, security from random acts of police violence, and so on and so forth. All these would be some of the props that will allow us to be good. But most importantly is the avoidance of threats to our immediate loved ones. Because if we're following Aristotle, the good life depends on the security of all your loved ones. If something harms your loved ones, you yourself cannot be expected to be good. So the key point to be taken from Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics is actually that you will fail. Your capacity to undertake ethically salient actions will atrophy on the loss of worldly goods. So I always tell my students, we need to print T-shirts. Aristotle, goods to be good. Yeah, more goods to be good. So a recap of keywords. So now we are pivoting to Toni Morrison. So recap of some of the concepts which we are now carrying forward into the next phase. The historical transition, and the disputes about central organizing concepts. I mentioned decay, ethos, and so on, but now we have concepts such as honor. What is it to be an honorable person? Virtue, what is it to be virtue? Selfhood and autonomy. And we'll come to see how each of these becomes a subject of dispute. Suffering is a form of discombobulation and a threat to self-integrity. Unruly affective economies are the direct product of historical transition. And I'm leaving the last one out because it would have had me go through Frantz Fanon and W. Du Bois, but we'll skip that. Now, beloved, we're going to land. So we've arrived at beloved. Now, first of all, a few dates. The novel is set between 1855, the events in the novel, spread between 1855 and 1873, 1874. Now, 1855 is the year of the actual event that inspires the novel, which is the slave woman escaping Margaret Garner fearing being caught, she attempts to kill all the children, but manages to kill only one and is finally arrested. Toni Morrison reads this and she asks the question, what must have happened in the mind of the mother, the woman? So she's not so much interested in the facts around the case, the pursuit and so on, but what must she have felt as a mother to go to the point of killing attempting to kill her children? So this is the source of, so actually 1855 is historical. But also important between 1855 and 1873 is first the Emancipation Declaration, which was 1863, and then the Emancipation Act of 1865. The point of these dates is that the novel is set, the bulk of it is set less than 10 years after emancipation from slavery, when in fact the effects of slavery are still with them. The novel is set in Cincinnati, but the slavery is still in Kentucky because there's a time lag between how the different states get out of slavery. Now, each of the characters in the novel is then burdened with the task of defining what constitutes autonomy and freedom. What is it to be free less than 10 years after being a slave? And each character answers this question differently. In fact, completely differently. One of them, as we shall see in a moment, by arrogating to herself the power of killing her children so that they cannot be taken back into slavery. But each character tries to. Now, this is Seti. Seti is a central character. And I highlight this because clearly, Toni Morrison has an eye to the Greeks. This is how Seti is described. A face too still for comfort. Irises the same color as her skin, which in that still face used to make him think of a mask with mercifully punched out eyes. Even in that tiny shack, leaning so close to the fire you could smell the heat in her dress, her eyes did not pick up a flick. So her eyes are dead. The woman is alive, but her eyes there's no white in her eyes. And this is throughout the novel. So you're actually looking at a Greek mask. The Greeks. So, and this is referred to at different times. At the moment when she kills her daughter, this is from the slave master. Enough N eyes for now, little N boy eyes open in the sawdust, and so on and so forth. But the worst ones were those of the N woman who had looked like she didn't have any. Since the whites in them had disappeared, and since they were as black as her skin, she looked blind. But actually, she didn't look blind then. That's how she. The suffering has evacuated her eyes of color. Yeah. So she's masked. Now, her daughter, Denver, is walking home one evening from, the daughter goes to hide in a grove of trees. And one day she's to hide in the trees. And then she's coming home and she sees her mother kneeling in what she thinks is prayer. But beside her mother is a dress, a white dress, with its one arm around the mother. Both of them are kneeling. The dress is empty. It's just a dress with the arm around the mother. By the way, the novel is full of spooky details like that, but delivered in a magical realist style. Like, it's all good. So she goes in and she asks her mother, "What were you praying for, ma'am?" "Not for anything. I don't pray anymore. I just talk." "What were you talking about?" "You won't understand, baby." "Yes, I will. I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was my rememory, Some things you forget. Other things you never do. But it's not. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone. But the place, the picture of it stays. And not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture floating around out there outside my head. I mean, even if I don't think it, even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there, right in the place where it happened. Can other people see it? Said Denver. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Someday you'll be walking down the road and you hear something or see something going on so clear. And you think it's you thinking it up, a thought picture. But no, it's when you bump into a real memory that belongs to somebody else. Where I was before I came here, that place is real. It's never going away. Even if the whole farm, every tree and grass blade of it dies, the picture is still there. And what's more, if you go there, you who never was there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you. So, Denver, you can't never go there. Never. Because even though it's all over and done with, it's going to always be there waiting for you. Now, the concept of rememory, which has been written about endlessly in Toni Morrison criticism, I take it as a really fascinating philosophy of time. Because unlike Heraclitus, who says you cannot step in the same river twice, implying that time is a flow, Toni Morrison, through Seth, is saying that time is granulated. It's a form of granulation. And not only that, but each granule of time can absorb into itself the trauma of history so that it becomes, Leibniz would call it a monad. The philosopher Leibniz will call it a monad. A monad is a kind of a capsule of time that incorporates the meaning of the moment, the historical moment. Walter Benjamin also has an account. He draws on Leibniz to talk about in his thesis on the philosophy of history. At any rate, Seti says that the memory of the trauma of things that happened to me have so discolored history that it is there waiting for you. When you see it, it is not an ordinary deja vu. It is time which has granulated and has incorporated the trauma and is waiting for you. This idea of rememory, of what is really melancholia, because it is also, but the odd thing is that this melancholia, this repetition, is not the affliction merely of the individual who experiences it. So, because she tells her daughter that even you who have never been there before, if you go, you bump into it. Now, Seti does not apologize for killing her daughter. She doesn't suffer what Aristotle would call anagnorisis. Anagnorisis is knowledge, tragic knowledge. Anagnorisis, so reversal for Aristotle must coincide with anagnorisis, which is the best form of complex tragedy. She doesn't suffer any knowledge in the sense of anagnorisis because she doesn't regret killing her. She thought she did the right thing. But, and yet, even though she doesn't suffer anagnorisis, she doesn't have any special knowledge, there is something that suggests that her mind is that she's suffering in the sense in which I described it. Her mind is discombobulated. There are many examples, but this is one of my favorite passages. Unfortunately, her brain was devious. She might be hurrying across a field, running practically to get to the pump quickly, and rains, I'll close in 5 minutes, and rains the chamomile sap from her legs. Nothing else would be in her mind. The picture of the men coming to nurse her, one of the very terrible events, they strap her down and suck her breast milk by force. And she never forgives them. And she talks about this all the time because her daughter had been taken ahead. You know, some of the children had escaped, and she needed to carry the milk to her daughter, but they sucked her milk. The picture of the men coming to nurse her was as lifeless as the nerves in her back, where the skin buckled like a washboard. Nor was there the faintest scent of ink, or the cherry gum and oak bark from which it was made. Nothing. Just the breeze cooling her face as she rushed toward water. and then sopping the chamomile away with pump water and rags, her mind fixed on getting every last bit of sap off, on her carelessness in taking a shortcut across the field just to save a half mile, and not noticing how high the weeds had grown until the itching was all the way to her knees. And then something. And notice that something is totally ordinary, nothing spectacular. The plash of water, the sight of her shoes and stockings awry on the path where she had flung them, or here boy the dog lapping in the puddle near her feet, and suddenly there was Sweet Home rolling, rolling, rolling out before her eyes. And although there was not a leaf on that farm that did not make her want to scream, it rolled itself out before her in shameless beauty. It never looked as terrible as it was, and it made her wonder if hell was a pretty place too. Fire and brimstone, all right, but hidden in lacy groves. Now, it's too complicated for me to get into, but one of the things that I realized when I was studying, I have a chapter on this book on Beloved in tragedy and postcolonial literature, and what I say in there is that memory, the relationship between past and present in terms of the way memory works is in order to attach intensification to mundane objects. So the path of travel is not just between past and present, but it is between past, present, and intensification. So what we find is that her perspectival sensorium, all her senses become supercharged on utterly mundane triggers. And because they're utterly mundane triggers, she cannot anticipate what will institute the intensification. And so she tries, repeatedly, they say in the novel, she tries to keep the past at bay. She tries not to think about the past because she needs to, protect her mind from retain some sanity. But that's not what happened because she cannot protect herself because she doesn't know the mundane detail that will trigger the intensification of the perspectival sensorium. Not only that, we mentioned earlier that her eyes are completely dark. She cannot see color. So she says, this is her. Seti looked at her hands, her bottle green sleeves, and thought how little color there was in the house, and how strange that she had not missed it the way baby did. Deliberate, she thought, it must be deliberate, because the last color she remembered was the pink chips in the headstone of her baby girl. After that, she became as color conscious as a hen. Every dawn, she worked at fruit pies, potato dishes, and vegetables, while the cook did the soup, meat, and all the rest. And she could not remembering a molly apple or a yellow squash. Every dawn, she saw the dawn, but never acknowledged or remarked its color. There was something wrong with that. It was as though one day she saw red baby blood because she sawed off her daughter's throat. It was as if one day she saw red baby blood, another day the pink gravestone of chips, and after that was it. She stopped seeing color. The trauma, the shock of it reorganizes her color palette. But Toni Morrison, by the way, is magnificent. I'm teaching a course on all the novels of Toni Morrison this quarter. And I cannot tell you the amount of fun that I don't know about my poor student, but me, I am so happy. She has the most amazing uses of color, not just in this novel, but in various. So you can actually just read the novel for color and sounds. Now, this her reflection on color is actually, is not a preamble because the narrative is scrambled to one of my favorite characters. Baby Suggs is her mother-in-law. Now, when Baby Suggs first appears, or when she first escapes to Cincinnati, she starts preaching. She becomes a preacher woman. And she preaches a version of owning the black self. But her version is really fascinating because she tells all the gathered people, love yourselves piecemeal. Touch your ears, feel your throat, your lips. Now touch your face, your neck. So she instructs them on how to love. And you love your body. It's like after slavery, where slavery reduced your body to an economic object. How do you learn how to love yourselves? Love yourself piecemeal by touching. Know that each part is a beautiful sermon in the clearing. When the slave master is coming to capture Sete and the children, Baby Suggs bears witness to the tragic event. Seti captures the children. She scoops them up and runs into the barn, proceeds to saw off the throat of the 2-year-old and tries to smash the heads of the others. She fails at that and so on. Now, the event, the sordid event, is focalized through 4 different characters. The slave master being one of them, I just mentioned. The other person is he's called Stamp Paid. He does lots of things in the house, repairing broken pieces and so on. But the other one is Baby Suggs. Baby Suggs is the only one who can neither condemn nor condone the act. She can neither condemn nor condone the act. And because she can neither condemn nor condone the act, her faith in God collapses. And so she announces that, I'm going to retire to my bed to contemplate color. And this is a conversation that she has with Stamp Paid, a really, really lovely friendship they have. What I have to do, she tells Stamp Paid, as he tries to encourage her to go back to the clearing, is get in my bed and lay down. I want to fix on something harmless in this world. The conversation continues. What world are you talking about? Ain't nothing harmless down here. Yes, it is. Blue. That don't hurt nobody. Yellow neither. You getting in bed to think about yellow? I likes yellow. Then what? When you get through with blue and yellow, then what? Can't say. It's something can't be planned. You blaming God, he said. That's what you're doing. No, Stamp, I ain't. You saying the white folks won. That's what you saying. I'm saying they came in my yard. You saying nothing counts. I'm saying they came in my yard. Seti is the one that did it. And if she hadn't, that's the thing. If she hadn't killed her kids, what would have happened? She would have been surrendering them to certain death. So she can neither condone or condemn. And so she suffers this collapse of her faith. Baby Suggs is a beautiful character. And she spends the rest of the several years after just in bed asking to see different colors. And sometimes when they can't find the color for example, there's a point when she's obsessed with pink. And they don't have anything pink in the house. So Seti goes to her and sticks out her tongue. Because Baby Suggs wants to see pink. So this is part of the color coding. However, Baby Suggs is actually suffering a form of, she's actually suffering, the word suffering, a form of discombobulation. And I interpret her quest for color as similar to what we see in William Blake, Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. What immortal hands or eye, they frame thy fearful symmetry. Now, this is the poet, so I'm not going to continue, because in Blake's poem, Blake is also considering who was it that made both the tiger and the lamb. The fearful symmetry of the tiger also made the lamb, Who dared do this? So I think that this contemplation of color is also going back to there are things before offense could be taken. And you cannot be offended by blue, she says. You cannot be offended by yellow. Of course, we don't know whether she finds the meaning. The point of landing on Toni Morrison, though, is that, of course, The Beloved is a novel also about a really terrible part of American history, which is slavery and its after effects. But I think what Toni Morrison invites us to do is to a form of emotional accounting. So this is no longer just the mere enumeration of facts, number of slaves on a slave plantation, the food that they ate, and so on, the work tasks, and so on. But what must it have felt like to be confronted by an impossible ethical decision? You know, Aristotle says in the Poetics that tragedy is action, he says. But for Aristotle, doing this is not an action. It doesn't count. Or dancing a jig to some nice music is not an action. That doesn't. An action is something that bears ethical consequences. So for Aristotle, an action is something that bears ethical consequences. So what she invites us to contemplate is, what is it in slavery that confronts these, in this case, former slave people, with choices that have profound ethical consequences, but impossible. They are ethical choices that are impossible to contemplate, never mind to action or perform. And this, I think, is a beautiful gift, at least to me. Thank you very much.
Let me see how I can arrange this. I'm just gonna. Oh, that stays up. Okay, good. Can we hear it again for Dr. Quayson, please? Thank you. So I've been asked to be the respondent, but I just feel like the hype man here. You know, I just want to say some good things about both the presentation and the work. The book, as I've told Dr. Quayson, as far as I'm concerned, this book is as important as Edward Said's Orientalism. It is really changing the way that we look at these literatures and think about, the way in which Black, African-American literature is seen in this kind of post-colonial lens. And I'm going to read a few quotes, and just kind of, this is going to be a little stream of consciousness as I was feverishly taking notes during this. One quote I'm going to throw out is from Edward Said, from Orientalism. Something patently foreign and distant acquires, for one reason or another, a status more, rather less familiar. One tends to stop judging things as either completely novel or as completely well known. A new median category emerges, a category that allows one to see new things, things seen for the first time as versions of a previously known thing. In essence, such a category is not so much a way of receiving new information as it is a method of controlling what seems to be a threat to some established view of things. Dr. Quayson brought up suffering, the anticipation of experience of something or things that threaten the integrity of the self. Cicero remarking that instead things take shape through repeated, effectively charged references to an original traumatic event. Evils impending instead take shape through repeated, effectively charged references to an original traumatic event. And he just mentioned how Setha tries to keep the past at bay, her trauma, which reminds me of Aida Levy Hassan's study, How to Read African American Literature, which was published in 2016, in which she has this definition of what she calls traumatic time. And traumatic time, she defines it as a structure of narrative temporality prevalent in late 20th century and early 21st century AFAM literature that defies chronological mapping and instead takes shape through repeated, effectively charged references to an original traumatic event. Traumatic time is nonlinear, disunified, and regenerated by the impossible desire for a redemptive return to the past. Baby Sugg can't pass judgment on Setha because she, as she points out to Stampede, And I paraphrase based on Dr. Quayson's point on Hegel, Sethe had to choose between what was right and what was right. Paul D., in response to Denver, when she asked why all the Sweet Home men and Sethe, all the Sweet Home men and Sethe always talk about Sweet Home, Paul D. responds, Sweet Home wasn't sweet and it sure wasn't home. Aristotle, what he says about, I wonder what he would say about Breonna Taylor and other Black lives lost to presuppositions about their bodies. How would we talk about this through a lens of the good life? In Beloved, I also wonder what would Vitruvius, the first century BC philosopher of architecture, what would he say about 124 Bluestone Road in The Beloved, set in Cincinnati, Ohio? Vitruvius had, in your point about the good life, ideas about firmness, commodity, and delight, talking about structures that we live in and work in. And he would talk about the order and arrangement, the beauty found in proportion, symmetry, propriety, and economy. And I think about that as I think about that space that they were in Beloved. It also takes me to Christopher Alexander, The Timeless Way of Building, from 1979, in which Alexander talks about, of course, patterns vary from place to place, from culture to culture, from age to age. They are all man-made. They all depend on culture. But still, in every age and every place, the structure of our world is given to it essentially by some collection of patterns which keeps on repeating over and over and over again, which we see in Beloved. That's the part of the trauma, just the repeated pattern. And we see it today, as you were pointing out, in some of these situations. And I'll quote another intellectual titan, Ato Quayson, from his book. What we find is that this is from his, I think this is from the conclusion of the book. What we find is that different historical epochs in the 20th and 21st centuries illustrate collective modes of action that seek to subsume individual aspiration under a larger order. And yet these modes of collective action find themselves obliged to reach into the domain of historical exemplars so as to define what such actions might mean for the collective and the individual. History thus repeats itself as a collective morphology. I'm going to come back to the collective morphology. When you begin your chapter on Morrison, you mentioned the settler colonialism and the slavery plantation, and immediately I'm reminded of the ways in which Morrison uses the historical tragedy of Margaret Garner as the impetus of her novel Beloved, but from it all changed utterly a terrible beauty born to bring Yeats into the mix, as you do in the chapter. And I think that the beauty that is born here through interiority, which you just mentioned, and the fleshed out psychology of it all. We see the teaching of Baby Suggs that the characters learn to love themselves, their inner selves, and one another in the wake of trauma. Or to repeat, as Levi Husson notes, it takes shape through repeated, effectively charged references to an original traumatic event. The collective past becomes the collective morphology. The construction that I couldn't get out of my mind when I read the book. I'm reminded of how this notion of the past is a burden that one must relieve oneself of in order to transcend the stereotypes and caricatures of the past. When you offer, for another chapter, archetypes as a stand-in for stereotypes, it reminds us of what often goes unsaid. All literature, irrespective of its country or origin, builds upon and emerges from culture and history. But for some reason, when literature from the Black diaspora has examined the idea of getting over the tragedy of colonialism and slavery, is seen as a way of elevating it from this burden. The title character Beloved embodies multiple pasts: the past of family history, the past of family trauma, the past of feared futures, that is, those in the past who fear what's up ahead. And with all these pasts, here comes Beloved, dredging this all up from the lake, literally, from which she emerges. Let me see what else. Beloved becomes a central reflector of nearly every character in the book. How characters respond to her presence whether as the baby or as the ghost, gives us insight into their character. Like the house at 124 Bluestone Road in Cincinnati, Ohio, what's remarkable is that beloved, the character, becomes the locus of their trauma. She contains it like a receptacle that will hold on to fear and trauma, like the house. The morphology, back to your use of it, the morphology is one that Morrison innovates by bringing a slave narrative together with a ghost story, which makes perfect sense. But I think it makes more sense because Morrison embraced it. Within the culture, we often speak in terms of spirits and ghosts. We are known to speak to our deceased elders with the comfort that Denver displays with Beloved. This is not seen as normal by those outside the culture, and to be fair, by some within the culture as well. Nonetheless, it's common enough to say that it's real. It's a phenomenon, and Morrison renders it, which extends a tradition that may have been prevalent in folklore and is now represented in literature, and I'm resisting the phrase high art. Or as Morrison remarks in an interview with Christina Sharp in 2013 at Rutgers University, talking about magical realism, she says, Morrison, I also want my work to capture the vast imagination of Black people. That is, I want my books to reflect the very practical, shrewd, day-to-day functioning that Black people must do, while at the same time they encompass some great supernatural element. We know that it does not bother them one bit to do something practical and have visions at the same time. So all the parts of living are on an equal footing. Birds talk and butterflies cry, and it's not surprising or upsetting to them. These things make the world larger for them. Some young people don't want to acknowledge this as a way of life. They don't want to hark back to those embarrassing days when we are associated with haints and superstition, end quote. I'm not going to go on and on because I know we have questions, right, from the audience, but I'd like this. I'd say I'd love to hear more about eudaimonia, if I'm saying that right. You mentioned eudaimonia, but I'd like to hear more about this in relationship to what I see as stichomythia later in the novel, when Setha and Beloved's voices kind of merge and seemingly transplant within each other. This seems to represent not only a haunting, but also a cleansing of sorts. It's the only way this family gets to move on. I think I'll leave it there. Let you do your thing. So thank you. He has all the answers. I'm just.
He's the poet, so he has more. His answers are better. Boy, he's a poet.
Ato, I loved your presentation on the whole arc of tragedy from the Greeks to Toni Morrison. I love the comment on 124 Bluestone. I always think of 124 Bluestone rhymes with tombstone. Mm-hmm. You know, there's something about that arc. Yeah. But I have a philosophical question that I'm interested in tragedy like you. And I'm thinking of The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes.
And for Nietzsche, the most important part of tragedy is a chorus. Because as we know, there is a dialectic between the Apollonian forces and the Dionysian. Mm-hmm. And it's through the history of music that's so important to Nietzsche in the chorus, that then turns into the lyric poetry, which is tragic. So I'm wondering how that plays into your notion of, of suffering, of pain, of the tragic, of melancholia.
Yeah, melancholia. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, last week we did Song of Solomon, another beautiful novel. And Song of Solomon has lots of actually songs and singing. They actually sing, and the singing, sorry? Yeah, even the title. And the singing marks different moments in the text. So, for example, there's a beautiful moment where the central female character, her name is Pilate, and she's like a shaman, very powerful. And her granddaughter dies in a very terrible way. Basically, she's depressed. She loses her mind over her cousin, who was her lover and who abandons her, and very terrible. And she's going to be buried. So she's laid in the church. And Pilate walks in very regally and begins to sing. Mercy first. She goes through the pews and she looks at different people. She says, mercy. She isolates different people and says mercy. And then she begins to say she was loved. And then her and her daughter sing. So the novel, in fact, it opens on a song and so on. Oddly enough, Beloved doesn't have singing. I think Paul D sings when he's working. However, the chapter you refer to, the Stichomithia chapter, is actually a song. In fact, it occupies what we might describe as a chorus function. It's a chorus function of the three women. And the song, and there's a lot of call and response. It's a fragmented, it's 4 chapters, fragmented, but actually the style, the texture of those chapters is definitely not prose narration. It's not prose narration. It is not drama. It's highly lyrical. And so, okay, so that's the first thing. So it doesn't have singing, unlike Song of Solomon, but it has this segment of lyricism, which is really choral. It's a chorus function lyricism. The other thing is that by the end of the novel, you feel the novel has I don't know how to put this, but it has a congregational quality. You feel that you've participated in a congregation. The effect of reading that novel and seeing the kind of catharsis that is performed by this hate, this beloved character. And in the end, of course, it collectivizes them by saying, this is not a story to pass on. So it doesn't have music, but it has lyricism. And the lyricism would be Dionysian, to appropriate Nietzsche. The lyricism would be very Dionysian. In fact, if we were to appropriate, perhaps even misappropriate Nietzsche, the Apollonian would be the system of slavery, which requires forms of infernal orderings. Whereas the slave life is inherently Dionysian. But in the novel, this lyrical is the most Dionysian part of the chapter. Thank you. Of the novel. Yes, Shelley.
Thank you. I was really kind of dazzled by your efforts to bring together so many different time periods in conversation with each other. And I wanted to go back to the comment, I think from Aristotle, about the good life, which reminded me very much of what George Bernard Shaw said, which is not that if you'll be good, you'll be happy, but if you're happy, you're more likely to be good, which is very close, I think, to what Aristotle was saying. But what would Aristotle say about how you connect that with the kind of repetitive trauma that poor character in the first novel you discussed is forced to keep undergoing? In other words, is there any way to have them in conversation with each other?
Okay, Aristotle doesn't. That's actually a very good question. Now, in his account of the good life of eudaimonia, because eudaimonia, according to the Stoics, is a state that cannot be impeded. So Plato and the Stoics would say that you are either eudaimon or non-eudaimon. It's a state that you have, and you can't depart it. Aristotle would say that you cannot be eudaimon permanently with impediments. That is to say, there are impediments to eudaimonia. You can be impeded. But he didn't talk about trauma. He didn't talk about this, the repetition entrapment, the repetition compulsion, and how the repetition compulsion also makes it impossible for one to enact. And I'm trying to do a spin on, had Aristotle been faced with the young man, Mademba, Indiae, what would he have said? I think what he would have said is that Indiae is trapped in the impossibility of ethical choice making because he's always restored to the moment of giving mercy. But he has to give mercy and contradict himself immediately by killing the people who are asking for mercy because they are his enemies. So that in fact, Indiae is placed in a position of impossible ethical choice making. It is ethical for him to show mercy, but it's not ethical for him to leave them alive because they're his enemies. you know. And the only reason why he's at that stage is because he failed to show mercy to his more than brother friend. So I think Aristotle would say that he's not eudaimon. Obviously, he's a victim of a colonial war, and there's a whole thing about the cutting of the hands. You know, the fact that so when he kills them, he cuts their hands and keeps them, you know, and he freezes them. And the attachment to the hands. Why these trophies, these particular trophies, and so on? I think Aristotle would say that impossible is a kind of cancellation of the ethical domain. The fact that he's confronted by a choice which is ethical and self-canceling at the same time, in the sense that he ought to show mercy, but he cannot show mercy because they killed his friend anyway. This enemy killed his friend. So he wants to show mercy, and as soon as they beg for mercy, he kills them. It's impossible.
Also thinking about that scene with Baby Suggs, one of the things that she mentions in that was the loving of your hands. But whatever, every moment when she talks about, you know, love your face, love yourself, she says, you know, because, you know, in the yonder, they don't, you know, so you have to love yourself because they won't. And I think that's a part of it, like thinking about, to your question about the good life, not expecting or anticipating that is going to come somehow from yonder, as she says, but from the interior, and having to go to the interior to understand and figure out what the good life is for you. And I think what we see in that house is, even like in the, you know, for anyone else, that house would be a nightmare, you know, but, you know, for Setha, she's thinking, okay, this is, at least it's my house. It's my haunted house, you know what I mean? And so this is a part of what she considers her good life. And I think at one point she tries to explain that to Paul D. Yeah.
Said,
So
why don't you leave?
yeah, why don't you leave? That's it.
And also, Baby Suggs' call to loving is also an action in the Aristotelian sense, because you have to remember to actively love yourself. You know, so don't take it for granted that you have eyes or a nose or a face. No, you have to actively remember to love it, to love the different parts. So that yourself is the subject of ethical action in and of itself. Because by remembering to touch your face and to love your hands and so on, that in itself is an ethical act. Yeah.
It's been a while since I've read Chinua Achebe, No Longer Eve. And the title, of course, says it all, being torn out of one's culture by colonialism. But on the other hand, being torn out, you see it in greater depth in the role of a stranger, at least in part. And so there's a positive side to this situation. And of course, also in Africa, there's a history of internal colonialism, which puts people in that situation. So will we see a revisionism coming?
You know, to say colonialism has a positive side, I mean, you can say it. It's saying that a child born of rape is a good thing. Of course, it's a good thing, but it's a bad thing. The point is the self-canceling effect. So the child has been born of rape. The child is good, but the provenance is bad, you know. And you cannot ignore the provenance in evaluating, you know. So it has been said, oh, you know, well, colonialism brought peoples together, and so as if that intervention, without that intervention, peoples would not have been brought together. As if there would not have been different forms of development and so on and so forth. And by the way, the revisionism has already started. Some people have started revising, trying to revise, and they are not being taken seriously, because to revise it and say it was a good thing requires a major distortion of facts. So that's how I would say. Now, to still to switch to your side, Is there anything that can be retrieved from it? This guy, Cornel West, in an interview recently said, you know, the West has many things to be ashamed of, but not its literature. And so he says, Dante, this is him, it was filmed, Dante is mine. You know, it says, you cannot take Dante from me. In other words, the good things of world literature, and I said world literature, I didn't say European literature, world literature, of which there are many tributaries and different contributions, which, as I think, enhance our imagination and our spirit. These have to be taken. So when you read my book, you will see that I love world literature. I love Shakespeare. I literally, when I was 18 years old, I told my friends, and they thought I had lost my mind, that I was going to read all of Shakespeare's plays before I went to university. And that's what I spent my summer doing. In the end, two things I discovered. One is that I didn't understand much of what was going on. But secondly, I fell in love with the language, which I didn't understand. They had some resonances and so on and so forth. So I've been enamored of literature, of world literature, since about far back as I can remember. So that is something to be rested. So Cornel West says, Dante is mine. Leave my Dante for me. That we want. But there are a lot of things that are distressing and that are suffering-inducing, and that we also need to account for. Yes, at the back.
I just want to say that the Greeks are mine.
The Greeks, thank you. Sophocles is mine.
The Greeks are mine, and I love doing Greek plays.
Mm-hmm.
I love doing Greek plays, and I thank you so much for the work you brought forth, because I understand you're not why it feels. It just totally made the connection for me. I tell people all the time, you know, when I choreograph and direct Greek plays, I just feel like I understand completely the absolute humanity in it and how it's traveled through. So I just really want to acknowledge
Thank you.
and appreciate it.
There are moments in a Greek tragedy that, sorry to say this, they look African. Yeah. Like, for example, when Oedipus comes out of his mother wife's bedchamber, having learned that she is his mother wife, he takes her brooches and plucks out his eyes. So he comes back on stage with his eyes oozing blood. But the reaction of the chorus is really fascinating, because there's a kind of attraction, revulsion at what, because he is now contaminated. He is the pharmacos. But that attraction, revulsion also means that he's no longer a mere individual. The hero, when he was a hero, he was an individual speaking for himself. Now he is a property, he's owned by the entire community. So the horror they express at seeing him is actually the horror of communality. This is totally African.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Quayson and Professor Jordan, very much for this. And I was particularly fascinated by the comment you made regarding rememory and how it connects to some of the core concepts of Aristotle's analysis of tragedy, particularly phobos and eleos, fear and pity, and how he says any tragedy should be able to make a mere listener shudder and weep upon hearing it. And seeing your presentation makes me think of how that coordinates with rememory, particularly in the experience of a people, a diasporic people who have experienced fear and pity so much that it becomes a fundamental part of their daily life. And that makes me think of the mythology of tragedy, and inspires me to ask you the question then, as Athens reformed its myth around moments of triumph like autochthony, like Plataea and Mykale and Marathon, do you think it would be necessary for African American mythology to similarly model itself to create these greater moments for potential of triumph to empower Black people and allow them to engage in catharsis and leave the depths of that fear and pity and not always feel like that is all that exists?
That's a good and very slippery question. Because, there's a school that thinks that enough already, forget the past. Let's deal with the present. Some people think this, even in the Black community. The point is that the present doesn't look good. The present itself doesn't look good. But the reason why it doesn't look good is because the past has not been properly accounted for. Trump. Every day when we had just come from Canada, moved from Canada, and every time he was lambasting Mexicans as criminals, I felt a tinge of anxiety because I felt in the place of those Mexicans that were being. But this has, I'm switching to the Mexicans, but actually the debasement of others in a country that's inherently a country of immigration. This country is a country of immigration. In a country that's a country of immigration, this dehumanization of others, it's really terrible. It's a terrible thing. So the present doesn't look very good because the past has not been accounted for. In terms of narratives to empower, I think African American narratives are doing a pretty good job, in the sense that all the ghost stories and whatever stories that someone like Toni Morrison, the folk tales, signifying, and the insult tradition and the hip hop, because hip hop music is also a form of agency. The point is that these are nodal venues for us to discern different forms of agency. So it is not one account, they are venues, but they are venues in which agency is also delivered as a form of pleasure, of joy, hip hop music or jazz, and Toni Morrison, reading Toni Morrison, being sad and happy at the same time. So we don't need to create triumphant stories. We need to identify different venues through which we see agency and multiply those venues. And some of those venues can be Dante or Sophocles. That's what I would say. I don't believe, by the way, in enclaves at all. The new African American Studies Department is not going to be an enclave at all. It is going to be at the heart of excellence building, and anyone can be part of it. It doesn't matter whether you're Korean. I say this in my interview. Korean, Greek, or Latinx, you have a home there, because we're not building an enclave. So stories of triumphalism, yes, but really venues in which we can see agency. And if we see it in Dante, let's take it.
Can I say one thing also? Yes. Just that this is not pushing back on the question, but I would say that there might be space to rethink just, I guess, like the impetus behind it. Like when you think about like why should we give it up? Like why should we not think about these things? And I don't think in other literature, when you think about the cultural iconography of the literature, they don't tell them, oh, you need to stop thinking about, these tragedies of the past in your culture. And part of it is, I think that we do have work that's dealing with it and that is transcending it. We talk a lot now about hip hop, but the blues and blues idiom, so much of it is about sort of coping with that past and learning to move on. And it's not like I'm changing it. It's not like I'm, belaboring it, but I'm also figuring out how to keep moving forward in it. And so Albert Murray's literature, Ralph Ellison, Sterling Plump, Sterling Brown. I mean, there's so many, Langston Hughes. I mean, there's so many examples of folks who've like taken that and made something to rejoice out of it and to sort of move forward through it. And so I would just think, like, without holding on to that idea, we have to kind of let it go, just thinking about like sort of challenging that a bit, like why should we?
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you both, but I would like to say the following. Your stories have to become our stories. We have to hold all of this, reconcile it, deal with it, explain it as you have done, but it has to become our stories, not just the Black experience, but we have to understand that experience and understand and learn from it both. So thank you very much.
Do it.
We're doing it. Here you are. Thank you all.